And we are live. Welcome everybody back to Sigmar Academy World History 1900 to present. In this lecture we will look at Europe at the turn of the 20th century. So, Europe at the turn of the 20th century was the most technologically advanced and economically prosperous continent on the globe. Nationalism and imperialism influenced the foreign policy of the great European powers, with nationalism being the idea that one's own nation and culture should take priority over that of others, and imperialism being the idea of extending a state's control over foreign nations, either through military force or through diplomacy. And since the end of the Napoleonic conflicts, Europe experienced a reprieve from large-scale conflict. However, frequent border changes from minor wars and a complex system of alliances threatened to upend the political stability of Europe. So if we go on to our first real slide here, it's important to give some background about Europe in the 19th century. This is because as we go on to the 20th century, we won't really know why things are the way that they are if we don't have some background. So, starting in 1814 and 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, Europe held the Congress of Vienna to outline the new European order. Chaired by the Austrian statesman Clemens von Metternich, the Congress of Vienna sought to restrain the Republican, liberal, and revolutionary movements that upended the Ancien regime, which was the pre-French Revolution monarchical order of France. The Congress of Vienna aimed to establish a long-term peace not by restoring old boundaries, but by resizing European powers to balance against each other, keep smaller powers in line, and prevent another event along the lines of the French Revolution or the rise of Napoleon. So, Metternich is a strident monarchist, and he wants to prevent people like the Jacobins from plunging France into the Reign of Terror, and he also wants to prevent a figure like Napoleon from taking over most of Western Europe and running the show in Europe from one country. And so the Congress of Vienna aims to establish both of these goals, as well as to keep a long-term peace in Europe. And how they do that is they've sized the European powers, as we can see on the map, to balance against each other. In Germany and Italy, these states are not united at this time. In Italy, Rome is run by the Pope. We have the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the southern part of Italy and a collection of states in the northern part. In Germany, it's a confederacy, with the two biggest states to note being the Austrian Empire and then Prussia in the north. So historians like to debate how successful the Congress of Vienna was, but consider that from 1814 through 1914, there was no serious outbreak of a war on the scale of the Napoleonic Wars. So I would argue Metternich did a pretty good job. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see the revolutions of 1848. In 1848, a series of anti-monarchical, liberal, and democratic revolutions erupted across Europe. The revolutions threatened to upend the political order established by the Congress of Vienna. Though the revolutions ultimately failed, they succeeded in galvanizing the left and encouraging future efforts to restructure Europe. Relevantly, the Communist Manifesto was also published in 1848. So here we can see a picture of the Communist Manifesto. No accident why it was published during these widespread revolutions and turmoil in Europe by the subversive Karl Marx. And on the right, we see a painting of the 1848 revolutions in Germany. You'll notice that they have the modern German flag, which actually dates back to the year 1848. This flag is a symbol of leftism and represents, in my mind, a defeated Germany, rather than the black, white, and red imperial colors that we would see during the Kaiserreich or during the 1930s. Just something to think about with that one. If we go on to the next slide, now we're looking at the middle of the 19th century. During the mid-19th century, nationalism was on the rise across Europe. This is best exemplified in Italy and Germany. In Italy, nationalists sought to unite Italians under one Italian state, free from governance by the Pope or foreign powers such as France. Italian nationalists, led by figures such as Giuseppe Garibaldi and Count Cavour, launched the Risorgimento movement, which means rising again, and established the Kingdom of Italy in a series of wars in the Italian peninsula from 1861 through 1871. And here we can see three pictures. Italy was divided between the Papal States in the middle, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south, and then a few states in the north. with the Austrians obviously in the northeast. Giuseppe Garibaldi is a hero of Italian history, and he's the main figure we need to know who led the military effort to unite Italy. And we can see a painting of the conflict that went on. So a series of wars would be waged from 1861 to 1871, and Italy would ultimately be founded. If we go on to the next slide, in Germany, likewise, spurred on by nationalism, Prussia sought to unite the disorganized German states into one German empire. Led by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Prussia won a series of wars which resulted in the creation of Germany. The 7 Weeks' War against Austria in 1866 and the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 through 1871 ended the German Confederacy established by the Congress of Vienna and unified Germany with House Hohenzollern as the ruling family. So earlier, I believe I said that von Metternich was the second greatest statesman of the 19th century. Well, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck is the first. We can see in the picture on the left, Prussia went to war with Austria over Silesia, and Prussia won this war and united the northern part of Germany under Prussian rule. In 1870, Prussia and her allies went to war with France, and this resulted in the creation of the German Empire. This painting on the right, we see all of the German aristocracy raising their swords, swearing fealty to their Kaiser. So this is a very glorious painting and a glorious day in German history. If we go on to the next slide. The scramble for Africa. Another influence on the foreign policy of European powers was imperialism. The great powers of Europe were industrial and needed raw materials to fuel their industry. So this is brought about by the Second Industrial Revolution, which happened in the 19th century. Europe, they were building these militaries, they were building these industries, but they needed raw materials to fuel all of this. And the continent of Europe did not have all of the raw materials necessary. So, this prompted the great European powers to scramble for Africa. Africa could provide raw materials that were not in abundance in Europe and generate wealth for the mother country. Having an overseas empire was also a sign of prestige. To arbitrate disputes concerning Africa among the great powers, the Berlin Conference of 1884 was convened to regulate trade and colonization. So 7 European powers participated in the scramble for Africa: Great Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Belgium. And we can see over here on the map, France takes much of West Africa, Britain gets Egypt, South Africa, and a spattering of other parts. Germany gets Togoland, Cameroon, Namibia, and I believe that's Tanzania. Portugal gets Mozambique and Angola. Spain gets parts of Morocco. Italy gets parts of Libya and Somalia. And then Belgium gets the Congo. And Ethiopia and Liberia were some of the only African states not to be colonized. So the key takeaway we need to remember here is that Europe is industrial, it needs to fuel its industry somehow, and imperialism is the way to do that. So if we go on to the next slide. Power blocks in Europe. The Triple Alliance. Following the unification of Germany, Bismarck correctly anticipated French hostility towards the nascent German nation. To isolate France politically, he organized the Triple Alliance, which consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Bismarck also negotiated a reassurance treaty with Russia. He knew of Austria's opposing interests to Russia and vice versa, and he sought to avoid a German-Russian war. He also worked to forge cordial relations with the British so that the British would not ally with France, and he relied upon Britain being a centuries-old foe of the French and vice versa. So Bismarck, again, showing why he's the greatest statesman of the 19th century, he's trying to prevent the situation that Germany would find itself in during World War I. And he probably would have, too, but in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck. Wilhelm did not renew the treaty with Russia and did not maintain amiable relations with the British. And we'll see examples of that on this next slide. Yes. The Triple Entente. Wilhelm's failure to renew the agreement with the Russians led to France and Russia forming an alliance by 1895. You also have, from the 1880s to the 1910s, Wilhelm ordered an expansion of the German Navy to rival the British fleet in the North Atlantic. The British in turn commissioned more ships, creating a naval arms race. Wilhelm would also anger the British by sympathizing with the Boers in the Second Boer War, which lasted from 1899 through 1902, and for his bellicosity towards France in the 1905 Morocco crisis. So, Wilhelm, it's not that he was evil, it's just that he was incompetent. He's ruining everything Bismarck set in place to prevent the situation that Germany found itself in during World War I. Some of these things he's justified, such as the Second Boer War. The British did commit horrible atrocities against the South African white Afrikaners, and it's hard to blame him for wanting a strong German navy, but he was also bellicose and prone to bluster. We saw this in the 1905 Morocco crisis. And all of these things combined drove France, Russia, and Britain together, which is what Bismarck tried to avoid. So, feeling threatened by the economic and military might of the German Empire, France and Britain put historical hostilities aside and formed an alliance. By 1905, the Triple Entente consisted of Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire. So, I don't have the map up here, but you can imagine in your head. On one side, we have the Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia versus the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. If we go on to the next slide. The Russo-Japanese War. European powers were not the only countries that were imperialistic. In the East, Japan was on the rise and wanted Korea. So next time your leftist professor tells you that Europe is just evil and imperialistic, well, see if he says the same about Japan, because Japan was doing the same thing as Europe. So when they talked to the Russians, the Japanese offered that Manchuria would be within Russia's sphere of influence, while Korea would be in Japan's. The Russians refused this, as they wanted Korea to serve as a buffer between Russia and Japan. In 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack at Port Arthur. It was a decisive victory, and the ensuing war went poorly for Russia. As a consequence, the war established Japan as a serious world power. So here I've included both a map of the war and a painting. This war was a humiliating loss for Russia because they lost to what was perceived as a backwards Asian country. And it could have been avoided because Japan just wanted Korea, and they were willing to say Manchuria could be Russia's sphere of influence. But Tsar Nicholas refused, and the war went poorly for him. The significance of this is not only that it lowered Russia's prestige in the world, but it also marked Japan as a serious world power going into the 20th century. Now, the consequences of this humiliating loss for Russia would be severe. If we go to the next slide. The Russian Revolution of 1905. Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War was interpreted by other Europeans as an instance of a backwards, Asiatic military defeating one of the great powers of Europe. In Russia, this loss prompted widespread anti-Tsarist revolts in Russian cities. Tsar Nicholas II was able to quell the situation by establishing the Russian Constitution of 1906, a multi-party system, and a State Duma, which is a legislative body. The State Duma was largely teethless, and regarding the Constitution, Russia was still a monarchy, but Nicholas is making concessions here because the situation was that dire. During the revolution itself, 17,000 civilians were murdered by leftist revolutionaries who were led by Leon Trotsky. And Vladimir Lenin would later say that 1905 was the great dress rehearsal, in his own words, for the October Revolution in 1917. So if we look, we see a picture on the left and the casualties and losses on the right. Over 3,600 Russian military personnel were killed by the revolutionaries in the fighting. 17,000 civilians were murdered. Thousands of revolutionaries also died, but we don't care about them because they're killing innocent Russian civilians. It was interesting, though, how the revolutionaries managed to commandeer one battleship in the Black Sea, which would later be surrendered to Romania. So if we move on for the Russian Revolution now, we go to the Balkan Wars. By 1912, the Balkans had long been plagued by turmoil and intermittent skirmishing. Nationalism was rising, and the Balkan states wanted freedom from the yokes of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, who were the region's largest powers and exerted the most influence over the Balkans. So, the First Balkan War. The 1908 Young Turk Revolution in the Ottoman Empire both weakened the Ottoman Empire and it also emboldened the states of the Balkans to wage war against the Ottomans. In 1912, the Balkan League, consisting of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, went to war with the Ottoman Empire. the Ottoman Empire was soundly defeated and kicked out of Europe. The only Ottoman territory in Europe was the territory of East Thrace. Oh, there's a typo. That's what I get for doing this late at night. Oh well. And during the peace treaty, agreements made prior to the war over territory were reneged on, prompting the Second Balkan War. I will show a map. I don't think it's the next slide. It's probably the slide after that, but we'll see the Ottomans controlled parts of the Balkans, but after the First Balkan War, they were kicked out and only left with the area surrounding Constantinople. So if it wasn't clear by me saying the First Balkan War, there would be a second, and if we go on to the next slide, the Second Balkan War. None of the former allies were satisfied with the terms of peace. Serbia was angered by the creation of a new Albanian state, and Bulgaria was angered by Serbia and Greece's reneging on promises over borders made prior to the conflict. In 1913, the Tsar of Bulgaria ordered the army to retake the territory that Bulgarians viewed as being stolen from them by Greece and Serbia. Bulgaria went to war with Greece, Serbia, and their ally Montenegro. The Ottoman Empire and Romania would later intervene and attack a weakened Bulgaria from the north and south, in addition to Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro. The war was violent, with ethnic cleansings being committed by all sides, and the significance of the Balkan Wars were threefold. The Ottoman Empire was reduced as a power in the Balkans. 2. The borders of the Balkans were changed, at least until the next year, when World War I breaks out. And 3. The peace treaties only created more animosity in the Balkans. So, even though the Balkans had never been a peaceful place, we're really seeing it become a powder keg, and we're seeing that it will be the reason that World War I breaks out in 1914. Bismarck, if there's any doubt as to why he's the greatest statesman, he also predicted that the next major European war would start because of some damn thing in the Balkans. And he was saying that back when he was chancellor. So, if we go on to the next slide, these are the maps I was talking about. All of the territory with red lines through it was Ottoman territory and was lost by the Ottomans. A new Albanian state was created, and Serbia wanted all of this territory. It didn't get it. Parts of northern Greece went to Greece, and then Bulgaria claimed the eastern parts that the Ottomans lost. In the following year, Bulgaria went to war with pretty much everybody because they reneged on their promises. This part in blue that you'll see on the map was controlled by Bulgaria, but was taken over by Serbia after the Second Balkan War. And Romania made inroads into this part of northern Bulgaria, and the Ottomans made inroads into this southeastern part. So if we go on to the next slide. So now that we've set up Europe, the political situation, and the powder keg that it was by the year 1914, we can talk about what the forces of subversion were doing at the time. So prior to World War I, and 3 brackets around so you know who I'm talking about, YouTube doesn't like me to say the word, the forces of subversion were active in Europe across political, literary, as well as scientific, and financial domains. So let's talk about the political domain first. The main thing we need to talk about is Zionism. Zionism was in the air during the 19th century, and it was brewing across Europe in multiple countries, and proto-Zionist figures, as they're called, included people like Moses Hess, Sabbatai Zevi, Judah Alkali, Yehuda Bibas, and Zvi Hirsch Kalischer. They're called proto-Zionist figures, though, because they precede the First Zionist Congress. And if we go on to the next paragraph, Proto-Zionism denotes strains of Zionist thinking prior to the year 1897. 1897 marks the beginning of modern Zionism when Theodor Herzl chaired the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. The First Zionist Congress was an international assembly of Zionist Jews who would politically lobby for Zionism in the preceding decades. So before this, Zionist thinking existed. It wasn't organized. It wasn't powerful. Now we're seeing, after 1897, it's becoming powerful. It's having institutions lobbying for it across the West. But political machinations surrounding Zionism were not the only example of subversion at the turn of the century. Subversion in finance was afoot as well. This had been the case for centuries, mainly due to figures like the Rothschild bankers. But germanely to Europe at the turn of the century, let us examine 2 examples that aren't the Rothschilds. So these other 2 examples, in addition to the well-known Rothschilds, these are: the Jewish Colonial Trust was established in 1888 and incorporated into London in 1899. It was founded at the Second Zionist Congress, a year after what we talked about in the previous slide, and intended to be the financial instrument of Herzl's organization. And a subsidiary organization called the Anglo-Palestine Bank was established in 1902 to operate in Palestine. So the Jewish Colonial Trust was based in London. The Anglo-Palestine Bank was on the ground in Palestine. It engaged in unethical banking tactics and financed construction of the first 60 houses in Tel Aviv. At the time, the Levant is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It's not controlled by the British yet, but that will change after World War I, and Zionism will go into overdrive because the Jews have a lot more influence and are able to lobby the British easier than they are the Ottomans. We go on to the next slide. So now that we've discussed the political and financial side of subversion, subversion was also afoot in science and literature, particularly in the field of psychology. In November of 1899, Sigmund Freud published the first copy of The Interpretation of Dreams, in which he made absurd and perverted claims such as, human behavior is primarily driven by subconscious sexual desires of the id, all boys subconsciously want to have sex with their mothers, which is called the Oedipus complex, and that all girls want to have sex with their fathers and desire to possess a penis of their own, which are called the Electra complex and penis envy, respectively. These are disgusting, degenerate, perverted ideas from the man you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, and so they've been largely discredited. No one serious actually believes in stuff like penis envy, but these were in the air at the time, and they're very hideous ideas, and they would contribute to Mr. Freud here having to leave when a certain Austrian painter comes to power. So if we go on to the next slide. Okay, our wrap-up. So the main takeaways we need to know are that in the 19th and early 20th centuries, nationalism and imperialism influenced the foreign policy of the great European powers, which is the reason why Europe was the most technologically and economically prosperous of the 7 continents. We also have the takeaway that the European order established by the Congress of Vienna limited wars in Europe to relatively minor conflicts. However, frequent border changes, intricate alliances, and national rivalries made Europe a powder keg for World War I, and we talked about that a lot throughout the lecture. And our third takeaway is that subversion and Zionist activity were afoot in politics, finance, science, and literature. Now, our vocabulary to remember after watching the lecture are the following terms. Make sure that you are able to define or talk about the Congress of Vienna, Clemens von Metternich, the Ancien regime, revolutions of 1848, the Communist Manifesto, nationalism, Risorgimento, Otto von Bismarck, imperialism, the scramble for Africa, the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente, Theodor Herzl, First Zionist Congress, Jewish Colonial Trust, Anglo-Palestine Bank, and the Interpretation of Dreams. So that wraps up our lecture. In lecture 3, we will be discussing the Titanic and how subversive activity was involved in that disaster as well. It is not as clear-cut and dry and free of subversion as you were probably taught in schools. But that's for our next lecture. I appreciate all of you who have watched this far. Be sure to like and comment as it really helps my channel, and YouTube likes to shadow ban my content. And as always, have a good day.